is Horace Cooper, Project 21 co-chair, Dinesh D'Souza, conservative author, filmmaker, host of the Dinesh D'Souza podcast, and Harmeet Dillon, co-chair of the Republican National Lawyers Association. Horace, the justification from Biden to these Texas Dems who fled to mommy and daddy in D.C. is that the GOP just wants to disenfranchise black and brown voters. Is there any evidence of that happening anywhere, but especially where you are in Texas?
W.C. Fields once said, there was a sucker born every day. And apparently, our president believes that he can tell some of the boldest, baseless lies and that people are going to buy it. Here's a true fact. When he was vice president, they prosecuted more voter fraud cases than they did income tax fraud cases. They prosecuted more voter fraud cases than they did bank fraud cases. Now, are we going to conclude, as they try to imply, that the number of prosecutions tells us about the seriousness of the violation? Everyone knows that in Texas in 2020, more blacks voted for conservatives and Republicans, more Latinos voted for conservatives and Republicans. In fact, the legislature picked up seats on the right rather than losing seats. There is no claim whatsoever, no truth whatsoever to this claim.
No, they're freaking out because they're losing the monopoly on the minority vote. If that goes down, they're finished. They're finished as a party. Dinesh, the media could have fact-checked today's speech, but instead, it went like this.
That's his most, correct me if I'm wrong, fulsome defense of voting rights thus far.
I can't imagine a stronger, more robust speech.
The oratory was brilliant. The emotion was palpable.
This speech was certainly the most passionate of his presidency.
Dinesh, I don't think Nicole Wallace understands that if the H.R. 1 was in effect in the year 2000, she wouldn't be hosting a show on MSNBC because George Bush wouldn't have been elected president.
Well, you know, the Biden speech was such a crazy uncle emerges from the basement routine. It was full of such exaggerations and absurdities. The comparisons to the Confederacy, the Civil War. I mean, a war in which 600,000 people died is being compared to, say, voter ID checking. You know, I think that Biden, in a way, missed a huge opportunity because what he needed to do, I think, is lay out the argument and say, look, we need to have laws that, on the one hand, make it easier to vote, but harder to cheat. I mean, presumably that is going to be the criteria for any decent voter integrity law. Now, he needed to go down the laws one by one, starting with voter ID, and show, for example, make the case that voter ID, for example, makes it harder to vote. I mean, the same voter ID that people can obtain in every other sphere of life, apparently, is not available when it comes to voting. But voter ID does make it harder to cheat. But for the Democrats, it's all about making it easier to vote, and they pay no attention to the cheating issue, presumably because they believe that cheating is part of what they need to get them to the finish line.
Yeah, well, that's why they don't want the poll watchers to actually have the ability to watch what's going on. They want to keep them behind the, you know, the rope line. They don't want them to see what's going on. That became obvious today. Harmeet, the frauds in Texas had an interesting explanation for their need for private aviation to get to D.C.
When you break a quorum, you want to be successful. So I think everybody wants to see, you know, 51, 52, 55 Democrats on the same plane. Number two, you know, to get a flight out of town at a time certain with, you know, getting everybody to come in from across the state, you need to fly privately. There's no fancy couches or anything like that. This was just a regular plane that moved us from one state to another.
Harmeet, another Texas Dem said their caucus paid for it. Any potential ethical issues here?
Well, absolutely. And we don't know the timing of the decision for the caucus to pay for it, if that's even true. Yesterday's news reports taking a look at the number
on the plane itself traced that to a Lebanese-American hedge fund magnate out of Nevada who actually represents the country of Lebanon as a consul general. So you have to ask the question, what is he expecting in exchange for his largesse? And did they decide to raise some money and pay him back after this became a national scandal? Also, who is paying for their hotel rooms in D.C.? They could use some singing lessons too, by the way. And who's paying for their food and drink and that Miller Lite? Who sprung for the classy Miller Lite that they had on board as well? Laura, this whole thing stinks. And if I were, in a way, it would actually be better if taxpayers were paying for it because it would be accountable. We don't know what dark money forces are paying for this or what they're expecting in return. So this is thoroughly corrupt. It stinks, and it flies in the face of the fact that 78% of voters in the United States support voter ID, clean voter rolls, verification, bipartisan observers, and chain of custody. 78%. It's not even close. So these people are being hysterical over nothing, and they're claiming, and Joe Biden was next going to say that requiring people to vote in the district that they registered in is like Antietam. So it's just completely unbelievable, and they've lost all credibility.
Yeah, Horace, all of this kind of brings together the problem with education in the country. If you can compare, as Dinesh said, the Civil War to voter ID or any of these crises in American history, January 6th to the Civil War. But if people don't know history, then they might sit on social media going, oh, wow, this is terrible. So it again comes back full circle to making sure people understand the truth about our incredible country and how amazing it is that we arrived at this point in time, given everything that we've been through.
Well, absolutely, that is correct, that we really, really have a treasure, and it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to make sure that our brothers and sisters remember, understand, and revere. But it's also very, very disappointing when our president puts the D in demagogue and is willing to say these kinds of things. Normally, if you have some of these baseless claims that you'd like to put out, you get someone from the periphery to bring those out. The President of the United States is supposed to be above that. And that's what's really, really shameful about it.
Now, Dinesh, he had to prove his bona fides to the Sharpton crowd. They were crowing about how Biden finally stepped up to the plate today, correct? Yes or no?
Absolutely. And if I can make a point about Texas,
real quick.
The Democrats are praising the bravery of the Texas Democrats, but the Texas Democrats are subverting a democratic process. There's a legitimate Republican majority in the state. Biden himself said that the minority party needs to patiently acquiesce in the will of the majority. That's not being done in Texas.
Now, panel, thank you.